Welcome everyone, my name is Mr. Simone and I am here for the video presentation on the American Revolution. We're going to begin in 1754 and go all the way through the Treaty of Paris that ends the revolution in 1783. I'm really focusing on the chronology here for everybody, and the brief overview will go into greater depth in class. So why do we begin in 1754? It is because of the start of the French and Indian War on the American continent. This was referred to as the 7 Years' War back in Europe. But the basic premise of this war is a struggle between the French and the British. So on the American continent, it's largely over the building of forts in the Ohio River Valley. It's just a land grab. It's a conflict between the French and the English over their colonies in North America. And actually, in one of the early conflicts, we sent a very young George Washington to the Ohio River Valley, and he did suffer defeat in the early stages of this French and Indian War. Now, it's referred to as the French and Indian War, which sometimes is confusing. It's the French and the Indians on the same side versus the British and the colonists. The only Native American group that actually sided with the British was our very own Iroquois from New York. Now, during the early stages of this war, Benjamin Franklin organized a meeting in Albany, referred to as the Albany Plan of Union, and this political cartoon on the slide illustrates the essence of his demands. He really believed it was essential for the colonists to unite. So that is a picture of a snake sliced up with the initials of several of the 13 colonies representing each piece. And he believed that if the colonies did not organize some form of colonial unity involving troop deployment and taxation and governance, that they may not survive. The Albany Plan of Union ultimately was not officially approved, but it did kind of establish the precedent of colonial organization. So this French and Indian War during this time period is ultimately going to be a victory for the British. But now, while the war was being fought, William Pitt this is the treaty that ends the war. This is also called the Peace of Paris. And basically, Great Britain is going to acquire all of French Canada as well as Spanish Florida, and France is going to give up Louisiana to the Spanish. So this changes the map considerably in North America. But now I just started talking about William Pitt. So I wrote here, what is the significance of the French and Indian War? Well, this man, William Pitt, he made a promise to the colonists. And he said, if you are willing to volunteer your services to fight in this war, we will take care of the cost of the war. And I think that's very important for you to understand. However, when the war was over, William Pitt really didn't have the authority to follow through with that anymore. And as you know, probably, taxation starts to develop, and that gets the colonists very upset. So it's just an interesting little observation to keep aware of. Now, the French and the Indian War is also significant because tensions between the British and the colonists start to erupt. So while they're fighting the war, they were on the same side. Once the war is over, there's going to be a conflict in the Northwest Territory referred to as Pontiac's Rebellion. And this was, so the war is over, but now we have Chief Pontiac in the area organizing several tribes together to fight against white colonial westward expansion. And Pontiac's Rebellion is a bloody conflict. There was an exchange of, I think the colonists provided the Native Americans with blankets that were infected with diseases, smallpox, and the British Parliament decides we don't want our colonists to continue to be engaging in fighting with Native Americans, so they issue the Proclamation of 1763. As you can see here, with the different shadings, the Proclamation of 1763 simply says that the colonists cannot settle west of this line, which was roughly near the Appalachian Mountains. Now, the Parliament's desire was to prevent conflict, but the colonists viewed it as being told what to do by an authority an ocean away. So this is how it is a turning point, because prior to the French and Indian War, the British and the colonists were mostly on the same side. Whereas after the French and the Indian War, tensions start to emerge, and now you will see the initial stages of the call for independence and revolution. Okay, so how do the British start to impose all of these regulations on the colonists? Well, you have a series of acts here. All right, the Sugar Act is simply a tax on sugar commodities. The Quartering Act required the colonists to provide housing for the British soldiers in North America. And then probably out of these three, the one that infuriated them the most was the Stamp Act. And the reason why is because this was a tax on items that were produced in the colonies. So, and the Stamp Act could be on, playing cards, a marriage license, newspapers, all legal documents, and it required them to purchase a stamp. As you could probably imagine, the least popular job in the colonies was stamp collector, many of whom faced some violent episodes as the protests start to erupt in the pre-revolutionary era. The Stamp Act will be protested by the colonists with the Stamp Act Congress, and they are able to get the Stamp Act repealed. However, it's replaced with the Declaratory Act, which was a much more broad law that said that Parliament could basically do whatever it needed to do in the colonies. So even though it wasn't as specific as the Stamp Act, it still had the same power. And then you will see the Townshend Acts, which will be another series of taxes on the following items: lead, paper, paint, glass, and then the only one that I need you to remember, tea. This was the first time they start taxing tea. This license plate down here is actually a current license plate. It says Washington, D.C., taxation without representation. You probably are aware that the slogan for the colonists was no taxation without representation. They were under the impression that without any representatives in Parliament, that Parliament did not have the right to tax them. And that becomes the overriding theme of the American Revolutionary era. The reason why this is on the license plate in Washington, D.C. is because even today, with 435 voting members of the House of Representatives and 100 voting members of the Senate, none of them represent the city of Washington, D.C. Okay, so now Boston seems to be the epicenter of all of the colonial tension. And there are two incidents, first the Boston Massacre and then the Boston Tea Party, that best illustrate this. So we'll start with the Boston Massacre. There was a group called the Sons of Liberty who will be protesting many of the acts of Parliament, and they are meeting outside of a customs house in Boston. We believe somebody may have thrown a snowball with a rock inside, but regardless of who started the incident, the British military fires into the crowd of protesters, killing 5 people, one of whom was an African American by the name of Crispus Attucks. What I always find interesting about the Boston Massacre incident, obviously it's a tragedy for the people who were killed, but the Boston Massacre led to the rise of John Adams, who was the second president of the United States, but he was also, believe it or not, the lawyer for the British soldiers guilty of shooting into the crowd. And he did defend them in this incident. I believe the only punishment that they received was a branding on their hand. So that's one incident that shows the tension escalating. The second one is far more significant, and that is your Boston Tea Party. So I referred to the tax on tea earlier with the Townshend Acts. So now they do repeal most of those taxes, but they keep the tax on tea. Now here's where this is going to get a little bit confusing. You had two places you could purchase tea at that time if you were a colonist. You could buy it legally through the British and I believe the British East India Company, or you could smuggle the tea in illegally. And in fact, the smuggled tea was actually more expensive than the tax tea from the British. It's also important to note that the overall rate of taxation at this time for a colonist was 1/16 what British subjects were paying back in Britain. So regardless of all this, again, Sons of Liberty decide to dress up as Native Americans and storm Boston Harbor and dump 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. Now, this was in 1773. I should let you know 1 year earlier, in 1772, a similar group set fire to a ship off the coast of Rhode Island known as the Gaspee, and did so because that ship was looking for smuggled goods. So the Boston Tea Party erupts into a major conflict between Parliament and the British colonists. And as a result of this, Parliament is going to pass a series of acts that Parliament refers to as the coercive acts, but the British call them the intolerable acts. Nevertheless, I wrote all of them down there for you. They closed the Boston Harbor until all of the tea was paid for. The town meeting was essential to Massachusetts life, and they reduced them to one meeting a year. And this one is very vexing to the colonists. Any royal official who was accused of a crime in the colonies would be put on trial before a jury, but that would take place back in Great Britain, which you could imagine would probably lead to not guilty verdicts. The Quartering Act was made harsher, more enforced, and would also require you to provide housing in your own home. And then, just to, add insult to injury, they decide to make Catholicism the official religion in Canada. Remember, most of the colonists at this time were Protestant. So we are almost at the point of no return. I just want you to be aware that all of these causes. Remember, I'm trying to find the slide here. The colonies were already being regulated with the Navigation Acts, but they weren't enforced before the French and Indian War. That was called salutary neglect. When you have laws, you just simply don't enforce them. Now, once the French and Indian War is over, all of these acts, they're now being enforced regularly, as are the Navigation Acts. So that's where the tensions really start to rise. Now, we're in a very narrow time period here. So in 1775, what is referred to as the Shot Heard Round the World takes place in Lexington and Concord. And that's in April. The fighting begins. Notice I've said nothing about a revolution. Notice I've said nothing about the Declaration of Independence. Then in June, there'll be a battle at Bunker Hill, although it probably really took place at Breed's Hill. So the fighting begins in 1775. The conflict actually starts before the Declaration of Independence. And we still have to get to a very important document that was published in January of 1776. This was by Thomas Paine. It's called Common Sense. We will read an excerpt from this in class. And he made the argument that the colonists should revolt because it was unjust to have a government an ocean away ruling them. And this, I'll go through this more in class, but this is published in January, and then hopefully, as you all know, it was in July where the Declaration of Independence was finally completed by Thomas Jefferson, largely through the work of Thomas Jefferson. So again, the fighting takes place at the beginning in 1775. They already start with the armed conflict. Then 1776 is when Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which sold hundreds of thousands of pamphlets, impacts the decision from the colonists to declare independence, which was not an easy decision. You will see the colonists divided between those who were patriots, who wanted to break away, and those who were loyalists, who did not. And I think it's important for us to know that one colony that had the largest number of loyalists was actually New York. I believe the two that had the largest number of loyalists were New York and Georgia. But once the Declaration of Independence takes place, now the revolution is official. In terms of the battles, it's the Battle of Saratoga that's the turning point of the American Revolution, because this victory led to the French deciding to join in and support the colonists, led by the General Lafayette. And then the final battle will be the Battle of Yorktown, which is where the surrender will take place. The Treaty of Paris, officially signed in 1783, and in this, Britain agrees to recognize the independence of the Americans. The Mississippi River is established as their boundary for the West. The Americans will have all fishing rights off the coast of Canada. And then the one concession the Americans agree to is that they will pay for property that was confiscated from the Loyalists. So this is my chronology, timeline, overview. This will allow us to go into greater depth in class. I hope you were able to follow, and have a great day.